The late afternoon sun hung low over the small town of Willow Creek, casting long shadows across the quiet streets. The diner at the corner of Main Street was one of those places that time had barely touched. A few cracked tiles, a faded neon sign, but the same warm smell of fresh coffee and grilled burgers that had filled it for decades. Walter Grizzly Hayes sat at his usual booth, sipping black coffee from a ceramic mug worn smooth by years of use. His hands, wrinkled with age but still strong, rested on the table near his old flip phone, the only piece of technology he had ever trusted. At 90 years old, Grizzly didn't move as fast as he used to, but his mind was sharp and his presence carried the quiet weight of a man who had seen war and walked away from it. Most of the regulars knew better than to disturb him. He was a legend in town, not just because he was one of the last surviving World War II and Korean War veterans, but because even in his old age, he had a presence that demanded respect. But not everyone in town knew that. Hello, Mr. Pictures here. Before we continue to the story, please subscribe to the channel as it allows me to do more of these stories. Thank you. Back to it. The first sign of trouble came with the deep rumble of motorcycles pulling up outside the diner. The growl of engines echoed against the storefronts, rattling the window panes. Heads turned, conversations stilled. Through the glass, Grizzly watched as three young men stepped off their bikes, their leather jackets bearing the insignia of a local biker gang that had been causing trouble around town. They weren't the worst crew he had seen, but they were loud, arrogant, the kind of men who had never been told no in their lives. The door swung open hard, making the bell above it jangle violently. The bikers stepped inside, bringing with them the smell of motor oil and cheap beer. The tallest of them, a lean, sharp-jawed kid with too much swagger, walked straight to the counter, ignoring the other customers like they didn't exist. Grizzly didn't look away. He had seen men like them before, all bark, no bite. They leaned against the counter, ignoring the waitress who had stopped mid-step, unsure whether to greet them or back away. One of the bikers, a stocky guy with a buzz cut, grabbed a coffee mug off an empty table, took a sniff, and then poured it out onto the floor with a smirk. The tension in the room thickened instantly. Grizzly didn't move. He took another sip of his coffee, watching. The leader of the group, the tall one, finally turned, his eyes scanning the room, looking for someone to toy with. His gaze landed on Grizzly. "Well, look at this," he said, grinning. He nudged the biker next to him. "Old-timer looks like he's been sitting here since the war." The other two chuckled. Grizzly didn't react. "Hey, Grandpa," the leader continued, stepping closer. "How about we take that booth? Looks like you've had enough time in it." Still, Grizzly didn't move. The kid's smile faltered slightly. He wasn't used to being ignored. He stepped forward, placing both hands on the table, leaning in close. "Hey, old man," he said, voice quieter now. "I'm talking to you." Grizzly looked up slowly, locking eyes with him. His gaze was steady, unshaken, the kind that had once stared down enemy soldiers without blinking. "You got about 5 seconds," Grizzly said, his voice gravelly from years of cigars and hard living, "to take your hands off my table and walk away." The kid blinked, surprised at the lack of fear. Then he let out a short, amused laugh. "Oh yeah? Or what?" Grizzly sighed, reaching into his jacket pocket. The bikers tensed, their hands twitching toward their belts. They were expecting a gun. Instead, Grizzly pulled out his flip phone. He flipped it open and pressed a single button, brought the phone to his ear, spoke 6 simple words. "It's Grizzly, I need a favor." Then he set the phone down on the table, still open, and went back to sipping his coffee. The bikers looked at each other, confused. The leader chuckled. "Who the hell did you just call? The retirement home?" Grizzly didn't answer. The bikers' grin started to fade as the silence stretched. Then they heard it. The distant low rumble of approaching engines. One of the bikers turned toward the window, his face going pale. From down the street, multiple motorcycles rolled in, their headlights cutting through the evening shadows. Not just 3, not 5, more than a dozen. And behind them, black SUVs, military grade, unmarked, the kind that didn't belong in a quiet town like Willow Creek. The leader of the bikers turned back to Grizzly, his expression uncertain now. "Who the hell did you call, old man?" Grizzly lifted his coffee cup to his lips, smirked. "You'll see." Outside, the first motorcycles came to a stop, their riders stepping off. Big men, old but strong, wearing leather vests with patches that told stories of wars fought in foreign lands. Some had scars, some had tattoos that only meant something to soldiers, but all of them had the same look in their eyes. The look of men who had walked through fire and come out the other side. And leading them, a man built like a brick wall, his beard streaked with gray, a Special Forces insignia still stitched into his jacket. He stepped through the doors of the diner without hesitation, his boots heavy against the tile. His gaze landed on Grizzly. "Who's the problem?" Grizzly casually gestured toward the bikers without even looking at them. These boys seem to have forgotten their manners. The leader of the bikers took a half step back, swallowing hard. The man standing in front of him didn't raise his voice, didn't reach for a weapon. He just stared. "You disrespected him?" the newcomer asked, his tone like steel. The biker tried to laugh it off. "It was just a joke, man. No harm done." The veteran didn't smile. "Then apologize." The biker hesitated. The rest of the veterans moved forward slightly, the weight of their presence crushing the air out of the room. The leader of the bikers licked his lips, realizing too late that he had made a very big mistake. Grizzly took another sip of coffee, watching. He already knew how this was going to end. The air inside the diner felt thick, like the seconds had slowed down, stretching over the room like a taut wire. The leader of the bikers, Scarface, stood frozen, his cocky grin long gone. His eyes darted between Grizzly and the men who had just stepped through the door, men who looked like they had crawled out of war zones and never quite left them behind. Grizzly didn't have to turn around to know who had walked in. He didn't need to. He had spent a lifetime with these men, fighting beside them, burying the ones who hadn't made it back. He just lifted his coffee cup, took another sip, and smirked. Scarface took a half step backward, his boots scuffing against the floor. "Look, man, this ain't what it looks like." The man who had spoken before, the towering slab of muscle with the silver-streaked beard, tilted his head slightly. His name was Duke Hollister, a former Special Forces operator who had done more deployments than most men had birthdays. He had the scars to prove it, though he never talked about them. Duke stared at Scarface, his voice low and measured. "Then, why don't you tell me what it is?" Scarface swallowed hard, his bravado draining from him like water through a cracked bucket. The two bikers behind him weren't doing much better. One of them, the youngest, barely out of his 20s, was already inching toward the door. The other had his hands clenched into fists, but his knuckles were white. Grizzly exhaled slowly, setting his coffee cup down. "Duke," he said, his voice calm, "these boys thought it'd be funny to push an old man around." He finally turned his head slightly, his sharp veteran eyes locking onto Scarface. "They thought I was alone." Duke didn't blink. They thought wrong. The silence stretched so tight that the faint buzzing of the neon sign above the counter sounded like thunder. Scarface let out a nervous chuckle, forcing a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Look, we were just messing around. We didn't know." Duke took a step forward, just one, but it was enough. Scarface flinched. "You didn't know what?" Duke's voice was like steel grinding against stone. "Didn't know he was a veteran? Didn't know he fought in wars before your daddy ever learned how to shave?" His eyes darkened. "Or didn't know that men like us don't let things like this slide?" Scarface shifted on his feet, looking anywhere but at Duke. One of the other veterans, a leaner man with a deep scar cutting across his cheek, stepped forward next. His name was Ray Torres, a former Marine sniper, and his voice carried the kind of quiet deadliness that made lesser men sweat. "You know what I hate most?" Ray said, his eyes locked on Scarface. "Punks like you, who think respect is something you don't have to give unless someone makes you." He let out a slow breath. "Back in the Corps, we had a way of teaching people like that." Scarface's breathing had picked up now. His hands twitched at his sides, but he didn't reach for anything. He knew that would be suicide. Duke tilted his head. "We got a problem here, son?" Scarface shook his head fast. "No, sir. No problem." Grizzly chuckled, the sound low and full of knowing amusement. Duke studied Scarface for another long second before nodding. "Good. Then you and your boys are gonna apologize to the old man, pay for your coffee, and get the hell out of here. And if I ever hear about you pulling this kind of crap again," his voice dropped to something even lower, something colder, "we'll have a different conversation." Scarface nodded again, his throat bobbing with a hard swallow. His fingers trembled slightly as he turned to Grizzly. Sorry, sir, he stammered, his voice barely held together, cracking like a cheap foundation. Grizzly picked up his coffee, sipped it, and said nothing. Scarface turned to the waitress next, his face pale. I'll pay for the coffee." Rachel, still standing behind the counter, didn't say anything. She just slid the check across the counter with shaking hands. Scarface dug into his pocket, pulled out a wad of crumpled bills, and dropped them onto the counter without counting. He turned, looking toward the door like it was his only escape from this nightmare. Duke leaned in slightly, his voice just above a whisper. "Now say, 'Yes, sir,' and leave." Scarface nodded so fast, his head nearly snapped. "Yes, sir." And then he bolted. The other two followed immediately, practically tripping over themselves as they shoved through the diner door and into the night. The sound of their motorcycles roaring to life filled the silence, and within seconds, they were gone. No one spoke for a moment. Then, finally, Frank let out a long sigh and looked at Grizzly. "You really know how to pick 'em, don't you?" Grizzly smirked, lifting his cup again. "They picked me." The tension in the room broke. Laughter rippled through the veterans, the kind that came from men who had seen too much and knew when something was truly over. Joe, the diner owner, let out a breath and shook his head. "I swear, Grizzly, every time I think you're finally gonna settle down, you go and start a damn war in my place." Grizzly chuckled. "That wasn't a war, that was just a lesson." Rachel, still gripping the counter, finally exhaled. "I thought they were gonna..." She stopped herself, shaking her head. Duke turned toward her, his expression softening. "You okay, kid?" Rachel nodded slowly, though her hands were still trembling. "Yeah, just never seen anything like that before?" Duke smirked. "Stick around this town long enough, you'll see a lot of things." Rachel exhaled and glanced at Grizzly. "Who did you even call?" Grizzly smiled, tapping his phone. "Just some old friends." Duke scoffed. "Damn right." Ray laughed, shaking his head. "I'll tell you what, that's the first time I've seen a grown man look like he was about to piss himself over a flip phone." More laughter, more shaking heads. The tension was gone now, replaced by something warmer, something solid. The night outside had returned to silence, the neon sign buzzing softly, casting a dim glow over the empty lot where the bikers had once stood. The war was over before it even started. But Grizzly knew better. The war never really ends. And as long as he was around, he'd always be ready. The night outside had returned to silence, but inside the diner, the air still buzzed with something unspoken. The bikers were gone, their engines nothing more than ghosts in the distance. Yet no one in the room quite believed it was over. Rachel, the young waitress, was still gripping a coffee pot like it was a lifeline. The owner, Joe, wiped down the counter with slow, deliberate strokes, his hands steady, but his jaw tight. The rest of the patrons, mostly quiet observers, kept sneaking glances at the door, like they were waiting for the storm to return. But Grizzly Hayes wasn't waiting for anything. He had seen storms like this before. He had walked through them, let them pass, and buried the ones who thought they could weather it better than him. He picked up his coffee, still warm, and took a slow sip. His hands didn't shake, his heart didn't race. He had survived worse things than some two-bit punks trying to make themselves feel big. Frank Holloway sat across from him, rubbing his knuckles, a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. "That went about how I expected." Duke leaned against the counter, arms crossed over his broad chest. "They won't be back," he said, but the way he said it left the thought unfinished. Grizzly set his coffee down and looked at him. "Not tonight." Duke met his gaze, a flicker of understanding passing between them. Frank sighed, stretching his arms. "I don't get kids these days. No discipline, no backbone." "They've never had to earn their place," Grizzly said, shaking his head. "No war to break them in, no real hardship, just boys playing at being men." Rachel finally spoke, her voice quiet, uncertain. "But they will come back, won't they?" Grizzly looked at her. She was young, scared, but she had the look of someone who wanted to understand the world before it broke her. "Probably," he admitted. "Men like them don't like losing." Joe grumbled. "Damn it, Grizzly! I just got this place fixed up from the last time someone tried to cause trouble." Duke chuckled. Maybe you should start charging a combat zone fee." The laughter was short-lived, because then the lights flickered, then the distant roar of engines returned. Grizzly heard it first. His ears weren't what they used to be, but he still knew the sound of vengeance coming back around. Duke turned his head toward the window, his sharp eyes narrowing. Frank tensed beside him, the amusement draining from his face. Outside, the headlights were back, but this time, they weren't alone. There were more bikes, a lot more, and a black truck, a big one. Frank exhaled, rubbing his face. Well, so much for a quiet night. Joe muttered something under his breath before disappearing into the kitchen. Rachel backed away from the counter, her fingers digging into the edge of the table. "What do we do?" Grizzly didn't move. He just picked up his coffee, took a slow sip, and smirked. "We let 'em come." The roar of the bikes grew louder, filling the night, shaking the windows. The truck rumbled up behind them, its high beams cutting through the glass, casting long shadows over the floor. Duke exhaled slowly. "They brought backup?" "Of course they did," Grizzly muttered, setting his cup down. The bikers didn't wait this time. The diner doors slammed open, rattling on their hinges. The first man through wasn't Scarface. He was bigger, older, someone with more scars and less patience. Grizzly's eyes flicked up. He recognized this type. He'd met men like him in every war he ever fought. This wasn't just another punk trying to act tough. This was a man who thought violence was the answer to everything. Scarface followed close behind, but this time, he wasn't running his mouth. His eyes were darting around the room, his bravado tempered by the beating his pride took earlier. The older biker, the new leader, looked around the room, then at Grizzly. His mouth pulled into a slow grin, but his eyes were cold. "You must be the old bastard who made my nephew look like a fool." Grizzly didn't blink. "Depends. Which one was your nephew?" A low chuckle rippled through the bikers behind him, but there was no humor in it. Scarface spoke up, his voice angry but cautious. "Uncle, these old guys..." The older biker lifted a hand, silencing him without a word. His gaze stayed locked on Grizzly. "They call me Mac," he said. "And you? You got a name, old man?" Grizzly lifted his coffee. "Folks call me Grizzly." Mac's grin widened. "Yeah, I heard about you." He gestured vaguely. "Old war hero, right? Lot of stories about you." Grizzly shrugged. "Some of them are even true." Mac laughed, but it was a dangerous laugh, one that said he wasn't here to talk. Duke shifted beside Grizzly. Frank cracked his knuckles. Mac's amusement faded. "Here's how this is gonna go," he said, taking a step forward. "You humiliated my nephew. I can't let that slide." Grizzly just watched him. "You come outside with me," Mac continued. "We settle this one-on-one. You win, we leave. You lose..." He smirked, eyes flashing. "Well, then I get to say I put down a legend." Frank muttered under his breath. "This guy's got a death wish." Duke didn't take his eyes off Mac. "What's stopping us from just handling this right now?" Mac grinned. "Because I brought friends." Outside, more headlights appeared, more bikers. Joe cursed from the kitchen. "For God's sake, Grizzly, my insurance doesn't cover gang wars." Grizzly sighed, running a hand over his face. Then, slowly, he pushed his coffee cup aside and stood up. His old bones creaked, but his posture was still solid. He looked Mac in the eye. "You want to go outside?" Mac nodded. Grizzly stretched his shoulders, rolling out the tension. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out his flip phone. Scarface flinched at the sight of it. Grizzly smirked. "You boys ain't the only ones with backup." Mac's smile faltered slightly. Grizzly pressed one button, brought the phone to his ear. "Yeah, it's Grizzly again," he said, his voice calm, almost amused. They came back. A pause, then a small nod. "Good," he said. "See you in 5. Then he hung up. The bikers behind Mac shifted uneasily. Duke grinned. Frank chuckled, shaking his head. "You boys really don't know when to quit, do you?" Grizzly stepped toward the door, his cane tapping against the floor. "Let's go settle this." As he walked outside, the wind carried a new sound into the night, the deep, familiar rumble of more engines approaching. Only this time, the bikes weren't coming for Grizzly. They were coming for war. The night air carried the weight of something dangerous, something inevitable. The smell of oil and burnt rubber lingered as the headlights from Mac's crew cast long shadows across the cracked pavement. The rumble of their motorcycles vibrated through the bones of the men standing outside the diner, but Grizzly didn't flinch. He stepped out first, his cane tapping against the pavement, his expression calm, unwavering. Behind him, Duke, Frank, and the rest of the old war dogs followed, their movements slow, deliberate. They weren't rushing. They didn't have to. Mac stood in the center of his men, arms crossed, his smirk wider now, confidence radiating from him. He had the numbers, and he knew it. "Still think this is funny, old man?" Mac's voice was oily, smug, the voice of a man who had always gotten his way through intimidation. Grizzly took his time stepping off the curb, his boots planting firm on the pavement. He looked at Mac, then at the bikes, counting the men without making it obvious. Twice as many as before, at least 15 this time. Some newer faces, probably prospects looking to prove themselves. Duke exhaled beside him. "Sure are a lot of them this time." Grizzly just smirked. "More for us." Mac let out a sharp laugh, shaking his head. "That's real cute. You know, for a minute, I actually thought you might be smart enough to stay inside that diner, drink your coffee, and let this whole thing go." "Never been good at letting things go," Grizzly said. Mac's smirk twitched. "Yeah, I figured, but see, there's a problem with that." The black truck behind Mac's crew rumbled to life, its engine growling like a caged animal. The door swung open and a man stepped out. Not a biker, not one of Mac's usual idiots. He was bigger, thicker through the shoulders, with a scar running down the side of his face like a knife had once tried to carve him in half. His eyes were cold, not the kind that looked for fights, the kind that had already been in too many. Mac grinned. "See, you pissed off my nephew, and normally that'd be enough for me to handle. But then I heard about who you were." He nodded toward the scarred man. "So I made a call. Figured if you wanted to fight, I'd bring in someone who actually knows what he's doing." The scarred man stepped forward, rolling his shoulders, cracking his knuckles like he was stretching before a workout. He wasn't young like Scarface. He was experienced, weathered, someone who had been around long enough to know how to hurt people the right way. Grizzly watched him, his jaw tightening slightly. Duke's voice was low, just for Grizzly to hear. "You recognize him?" Grizzly nodded once. "Yeah." Frank frowned. "From where?" Grizzly exhaled. "From a battlefield, a long time ago." The scarred man met Grizzly's gaze and smirked. "Took you long enough to figure it out, old man." His voice was deep, raspy, like it had been burned out of him years ago. Grizzly's lips pressed into a thin line. "Didn't expect to see you crawling around with trash like this, Calloway." Mac's eyebrows raised. "Oh, so you two know each other?" Grizzly didn't take his eyes off Calloway. "Yeah. We fought in the same war, on the same side." Calloway chuckled, shaking his head. "Times change." Grizzly narrowed his eyes. "Men don't." Calloway just smirked. "That's where you're wrong, old friend." He cracked his knuckles again. "You see, once upon a time, we fought for the same cause. But when we got back, I figured out real quick that all that honor and brotherhood stuff didn't mean a damn thing. The world doesn't care about old soldiers." He gestured toward Mac. "So, I found my own way." Duke muttered under his breath. "Damn, this guy's been drinking his own bullshit for a while." Calloway ignored him. "Now, here's what's gonna happen, Grizzly. You and your boys are gonna walk away. You're gonna forget this ever happened. And if you don't, well..." He spread his arms, gesturing toward the 15 armed men standing behind him. "We put you in the ground where you should have been 50 years ago." Silence stretched between them. Then Grizzly let out a long sigh. "You know, Calloway, I remember when you used to be a good man." Calloway scoffed. "Yeah? Well, I remember when you weren't an old washed-up relic pretending you still matter." Grizzly smirked. "Guess we both changed." Then he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his flip phone. Scarface visibly flinched like he'd seen a ghost. Mac's grin faltered slightly. Calloway's smirk remained. "Oh, come on. What, you gonna call in another favor?" Grizzly flipped the phone open and pressed a single button. He lifted it to his ear, his eyes never leaving Calloway's. "Yeah," he said. "They're here." A pause. All of them. Another pause, then a nod. "All right, see you in 30 seconds." He snapped the phone shut and put it back in his pocket. Duke smirked. "I love it when you do that." Calloway's expression darkened slightly. "You're bluffing." Grizzly smiled. "Am I?" Then the low, distant rumble of approaching engines cut through the night. Not motorcycles, trucks, big ones, with high beams cutting through the darkness like blades. Calloway's smirk flickered. Mac shifted on his feet. Scarface took an actual step back. Duke grinned. "Boys, you might want to rethink your life choices real quick." The first truck pulled into view, then the second, then 6 more. They didn't stop at the edge of the parking lot. They rolled in slow and deliberate, forming a semicircle around Mac's crew. Engines died, doors opened, and men stepped out. Not just any men built like stone, wearing jackets with old military patches, faces scarred by battle, movements too disciplined for street thugs. Some were bikers, but not the kind who just played at being outlaws, the kind who had seen combat and rode to escape it. Calloway exhaled sharply, his confidence finally breaking. Mac, for the first time since walking into the diner, looked genuinely unsure. Grizzly stepped forward. "See, Calloway, I might be old, but I ain't alone." He gestured toward the men behind him. "These are my people, the ones who actually know what loyalty means. And right now, they're real interested in seeing how this plays out." Calloway's jaw clenched. Grizzly's eyes hardened. "So, you want to start a war?" His voice was calm, final, absolute. "Then, let's go to war." Mac took a step back. Scarface swallowed hard. Calloway's fists curled. The standoff was seconds away from exploding, and when it did, there would be no coming back. The world stood still in the dusty parking lot outside the diner. The old neon sign hummed behind Grizzly, casting flickering red and white light over the scene. The only sounds were the low growl of idling engines and the whisper of the desert wind. Calloway's expression had shifted from cocky amusement to something colder. He had walked into this expecting an easy win. Intimidate an old man, remind a dying generation that their time was over. But now he saw the truth. He wasn't staring at old men. He was staring at warriors. Grizzly stood firm, his frame stiff with age but unshaken, unmovable. Duke and Frank flanked him, their hands loose at their sides, but their shoulders were squared, their muscles tense. The other veterans were still as stone, their expressions unreadable. Calloway's hand twitched toward his waistband, where a pistol was tucked beneath his jacket. His body coiled like he was ready to reach for it, to make this something it didn't need to be. Grizzly noticed. Everyone noticed. The weight of experience hung in the air, a silent understanding passing between the veterans. None of them flinched, none of them spoke, but they all saw it coming. Calloway had one last chance to walk away, and he wasn't going to take it. He exhaled sharply, his breath loud in the stillness, and Grizzly knew. He saw it in the younger man's eyes. Calloway wasn't going to leave with his pride bruised. He had come here to prove something, and if he couldn't do it with words, he was going to do it with violence. But before he could make his move, Grizzly spoke, his voice steady, calm. "Go ahead." Calloway's hand froze. Grizzly nodded toward the gun under Calloway's jacket. "If you're gonna do it, but if you pull that thing, you better make damn sure you don't miss." The weight of the words hit like a sledgehammer. Calloway wasn't facing some back alley brawler. He wasn't facing a man who would throw a few punches and leave it at that. He was facing a man who had put down enemies with a steady hand and a clear conscience. He was facing a man who had spent his life knowing exactly what to do when a gun was drawn on him. The tension cracked like a gunshot in the quiet. The bikers behind Calloway shifted uneasily, realizing they weren't just caught in a standoff. They were caught in a war they didn't understand. Duke took a step forward, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of authority. "You think this is your first real fight, kid?" he said. "You ever seen a man die right in front of you? You ever have to put your best friend in the ground because some bastard on the other side of the world got lucky with a rifle?" Calloway's jaw clenched, his face flushing. Duke nodded. "I have. So has every man standing behind me." He gestured to the line of old soldiers, men who had walked through hell and never fully come back. Grizzly took a slow step forward. "You think you know what fear is? You think holding that gun makes you strong?" He shook his head. "I've been shot at by men who actually knew how to aim. You don't scare me." Calloway's fingers twitched. His breath hitched in his throat. He was trapped between two instincts, fight or flight. And then the last piece fell into place. One of the bikers in Calloway's crew stepped back, then another. The younger ones, the ones who hadn't fully committed to this life, saw the writing on the wall. This wasn't a bar fight. This wasn't gang business. This was something else, something older, deeper, more dangerous. One by one, the bikers lowered their hands, stepped back toward their bikes. Even Scarface, still nursing his wounded ego from earlier, didn't dare speak. Calloway saw it happening. He was losing control. For the first time in years, maybe the first time in his life, he was outmatched. Grizzly tilted his head slightly. "It's over, kid." Calloway's nostrils flared, his fingers clenching into fists. His pride was screaming at him to do something, to take back control, to take back his power. But the problem was, he had never really had any. After what felt like an eternity, he let out a long, shaky breath. He reached up slowly and pulled his hand away from his gun. The fight was over. He knew it, and so did everyone else. Without another word, Calloway turned and walked toward his bike. His men hesitated, waiting to see if he would change his mind, but he didn't. One by one, they followed. Mac, the original leader of the gang, stood by his truck, watching it all unfold. He met Grizzly's eyes, gave a slow nod, an acknowledgement that some fights aren't worth the cost. Then he climbed into his truck and pulled away, leading the last of the bikers out of town. The night exhaled, the tension unraveling like a coiled spring finally released. Frank let out a sharp breath, shaking his head. "Damn." Duke chuckled, rubbing the back of his neck. Thought for sure that kid was gonna try something stupid. Grizzly smirked. He almost did. Rachel peeked out from behind the diner's door, her eyes wide. Did we just win?" Joe let out a relieved breath, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Damn near gave me a heart attack, but yeah, looks like we did." Duke clapped Grizzly on the shoulder. "You always know the right thing to say, don't you?" Grizzly picked up his cane, leaning on it as he turned back toward the diner. "Not always, but when I do, it's usually right before someone tries to kill me." Laughter rippled through the group, a mix of relief and the old camaraderie that never really faded. Inside the diner, the neon lights still hummed, the smell of coffee and fried food filling the air again. The world hadn't changed, but something had settled. Grizzly took his seat, picked up his coffee, and smirked. "Well," he said, taking a sip, "that was fun." Frank laughed, shaking his head. "You got a real funny definition of fun, old man." Joe sighed, pouring more coffee. "Next time you want to start a war, Grizzly, maybe take it outside of my damn diner." Rachel smiled. "Next time? Are you expecting more trouble?" Grizzly shrugged, his eyes twinkling with something almost mischievous. "Kid, there's always more trouble. But tonight they had won, and that was enough." The end.